Imagine, like, if you will, uh, hazardous material so common, so sneaky, it's been called, get this, the hidden killer, hiding in plain sight in, well, millions of buildings all over Europe. And the thing is, you might be surprised to learn that we're actually talking about asbestos. And today we're really going deep on Catalonia's, well, you could say audacious plan to totally wipe out this silent threat by, get this, 2032.
That's right. And I mean, this isn't just some empty promise. We're really digging into the nitty-gritty of Catalonia's national plan for the eradication of asbestos 2023-2032. It's a fascinating document, actually, both in how ambitious it is and how incredibly detailed their approach is.
Okay, so before we get into, all the ins and outs of this plan, can you give us a quick refresher on why asbestos is such a big deal? I feel like, when most people think asbestos, they think like scary old buildings, but it seems like from what I'm reading here, it's way more common than we realize.
Oh, absolutely. See, asbestos, it's not just one thing, right? It's actually like a group of minerals that occur naturally, and they were really valued because they're strong and, fire resistant.
Yeah, makes sense.
So naturally, that made them, incredibly useful in construction. Like, think about it, insulation, roofing, flooring, you name it. For decades, if it was building material, it probably had asbestos in it.
And that's the problem, right? This miracle material, not so miraculous after all.
Sadly, no. What we know now is that when those tiny asbestos fibers get in the air and people breathe them in, it can really, really mess up your lungs. Like, we're talking serious diseases here, things like asbestosis, lung cancer, and mesothelioma.
Mesothelioma, that's the really aggressive cancer, right?
Exactly, a really nasty one. And here's the thing, these diseases, they can take like years, even decades to show up. So early detection is, well, it's really, really hard.
It's like a ticking time bomb. In so many ways, it makes you wonder, why would they even, why was this stuff ever used so much in the first place?
Well, hindsight's 20/20, right? It wasn't until, let me see, 2002 that asbestos was finally banned in Spain. Before that, especially between like the 60s and the 80s, it was everywhere. In fact, this document, it highlights that Catalonia alone, just Catalonia, still has something like over 4 million tons of materials with asbestos, mostly fibrous cement, still in use today.
4 million tons. That's
Yeah.
just wild. Really puts Catalonia's 2032 deadline into perspective. But let's be honest, just ripping out all that asbestos, that's not really an option, is it?
No, not at all. It's way more complicated than that. It needs to be strategic, a multi-pronged approach. And that's exactly what this plan, we're going to talk about, that's what it lays out. Catalonia's approach, they break it down into 4 key areas: identification, removal, prevention, and, this is interesting, establishing new laws.
Okay, so let's break down this whole 4-pronged approach. Starting with identification, how are they even going to find all of this asbestos?
They're taking this very, very seriously, like it's a public health crisis, which it is. Essentially, they're creating what they call an asbestos census, which is, this centralized database that's going to document every single, or at least that's the goal, every single instance of asbestos-containing materials. And they're using some pretty high-tech methods to do it.
Like what? I gotta know.
Well, for one, they're using satellites.
No way.
Yeah, and not just, your run-of-the-mill Google Maps. These are special satellites. They have technology that can actually pick up on what they call the spectral signature of fibrous cement roofs.
Wow, so they're really going all out. Asbestos detective work, I like it. I'm guessing they aren't stopping there, though.
Oh, definitely not. They're also making it mandatory to identify asbestos during building inspections. They're even talking about, suggesting they increase how serious an asbestos finding is, like the level of severity on an inspection report, which apparently right now is pretty low.
Interesting.
And get this, they're pushing for asbestos certificates, like when you buy or sell a property, similar to those energy performance certificates,
So they're trying to get, the full picture of the asbestos situation everywhere, from, government buildings to people's houses. But what about actually removing this stuff? That's got to be the toughest part, right?
It is. The national plan, it sets a very clear deadline. All public buildings by 2028 and literally everything else by 2032. And that's to, align with those EU targets for asbestos removal.
Ah, right, the EU targets. Just to remind us, what are those exactly?
Right, so the EU, they set this goal for all the member states to manage asbestos in a way that stops, completely prevents any new exposure by 2032. So that includes removing it safely, disposing of it properly, but also, putting things in place to prevent people from just accidentally being exposed, which Catalonia's plan also addresses, by the way.
Okay, so the clock is ticking to meet that 2032 deadline. But how are they planning on making sure everyone's on board, especially when it comes to, private buildings and stuff? Those can be really tricky.
They're doing a 2-pronged approach. Incentives, and this is key, penalties. So on the one hand, they're going to offer subsidies, like financial help, and they also want to make the whole process, the paperwork and all that, easier for private owners to deal with if they comply.
Hmm.
But, and this is important, they're also suggesting penalties for anyone who doesn't meet that 2032 deadline.
Now, that's what I like to hear, a little motivation, right?
Exactly.
The old carrot and stick approach to asbestos removal. But before we get too deep into the legal stuff, I'm really curious about the logistics of it all. Like, where does all this asbestos go once it's out of the buildings? We can't just bury it and, hope for dust, can we?
You'd think, right. But no, you're right. Just burying it, it's just kicking the can down the road, creating a problem for the future.
Yeah.
And to be fair, the document does acknowledge that. They even point out this very specific challenge. Like, what do you do when the asbestos, it's all mixed up with regular construction waste? You have to separate it super carefully so it doesn't contaminate everything.
Right, of course.
But here's where it gets really interesting. They're looking into, get this, new technologies to neutralize the asbestos.
Mm.
Like, completely.
Neutralize it. What does that even mean? Are we talking about some kind of high-tech asbestos-eating bacteria or something?
Not quite, although that would be cool. No, they specifically mentioned looking into plasma torches. So these torches, they get so hot, like incredibly hot, that they can actually break down the asbestos on a molecular level. Basically, it turns into this harmless slag.
Plasma torches. Now that sounds pretty futuristic. Okay, so we've covered identification and removal, two major pieces of the puzzle. What about preventing future exposure? It sounds like Catalonia is thinking long-term here, too.
100%. This is where I think their approach goes beyond just reacting to the problem. They're investing heavily in educating people, training people. Public awareness campaigns are a huge part of their plan. Just getting the word out there about how dangerous asbestos is and safe handling practices, especially for people, if they live or work in older buildings.
Yeah, that's important, because even if they're not using asbestos anymore, the danger's still there, right? People need to know what they're dealing with.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's not just about the average person on the street either. They're developing specific training, targeted training programs for professions where you're more likely to come across asbestos. We're not just talking construction workers, although them too, obviously, but also electricians, plumbers, even mechanics and cleaners, anyone who might just stumble across some asbestos while they're working.
Wow. It's kind of crazy how widely used asbestos was when you really think about it.
It really is.
It makes these training programs that much more important.
Right. And on top of that, they're talking about improving emergency protocols, for those just-in-case situations that involve buildings with asbestos, like what happens if there's a fire or an earthquake. They're thinking about literally every scenario where asbestos could be a risk.
It's amazing how thorough they're being. Really seems like they're leaving no stone unturned when it comes to prevention. It's clear that Catalonia is not messing around here. They're putting their money where their mouth is, both literally and figuratively.
That's a good way to put it. This isn't just some vague plan for the future. They're putting serious resources behind this and putting concrete measures in place. And one of the most striking things is how much emphasis they put on the legal side, which you mentioned earlier. They get that this is just as much a legal and regulatory challenge as it is a technical one.
Okay, yeah, let's talk about these new laws. They mentioned that this isn't just a national issue, but something they're pushing for at a European level too. What exactly are they hoping to achieve with that?
Basically, it's about presenting a united front against asbestos. So while they're drafting their own specific asbestos law just for Catalonia, they also plan to advocate for changes nationally. They specifically call for faster implementation of the National Compensation Fund for asbestos victims. Because they know that justice delayed is justice denied, right?
Right.
Especially in these cases.
So it really sounds like they're trying to create this super comprehensive and unified approach to getting rid of asbestos for good, from identifying and removing the immediate dangers to preventing future exposure and taking care of the people who are already dealing with the consequences. This is more than just checking a box. It's about a real long-term commitment to public health and safety, which is great to see.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And it's a commitment that's going to take a lot of work and, let's be real, a lot of money. Which brings us to the next part of our deep dive, Catalonia's dedication to this cause, both financially and in terms of the research and development they're doing.
All right, let's get down to brass tacks. We know Catalonia is not messing around here, but how much money are we actually talking about?
Yeah, they're putting their money where their mouth is, that's for sure. From what I can tell, it's over 10 million euros just in their 2023 budget, specifically for getting rid of asbestos.
10 million! That's a serious chunk of change. But it's not just about throwing money at the problem, right? It sounds like they're also putting a lot of effort into finding, smarter solutions, like those plasma torches we were talking about before.
Exactly. And that's what's so cool about this whole thing, right?
Yeah.
They're not just settling for the way things have always been done.
Yeah.
They're really exploring these cutting-edge technologies that could, totally change how we deal with asbestos waste. Just think about it. Instead of just burying the problem, literally, and hoping for the best, they could use these plasma torches to just, like, zap it out of existence.
It's pretty mind-blowing when you think about the potential, right? I mean, if it works, this could be huge, not just for Catalonia, but for, like, everyone dealing with this stuff.
Right. It could be a game changer.
Yeah.
And this is where I think these regional initiatives, like what Catalonia is doing, can really make a difference. They can be these little hotbeds of innovation and like inspire change on a much bigger scale.
Yeah.
But, while we're geeking out over all this cool technology, it's important to remember that behind all of this, behind the plans and the deadlines and everything, there are real people whose lives have been affected by this stuff.
Oh, absolutely. It's easy to get caught up in all the details, but at the end of the day, this is about people's health and well-being.
Exactly. And to their credit, the plan does acknowledge that human cost. They talk about this program they have in Catalonia, it's already up and running, that's providing ongoing health monitoring for workers who've been exposed to asbestos.
That's amazing, because even if we manage to eliminate all the asbestos in the world, there are still people who are dealing with the consequences of past exposure, right? What kind of support does this program actually offer?
So it's pretty comprehensive, actually. First and foremost, it makes sure that these workers have access to regular medical checkups, screenings, all that, to try and catch any potential asbestos-related illnesses as early as possible. But it goes way beyond just medical care, too. They actually help the workers navigate the system, to get official recognition for having an occupational illness, which, let's be honest, can be a nightmare.
Oh, tell me about it. It's so important because those asbestos-related diseases, they can take years to show up, right? So proving that it's connected to your work, that can be a real uphill battle, even in places with good worker protection laws.
You're preaching to the choir. And, like, without that recognition, these workers might not be able to get the benefits they deserve, the compensation, even the right kind of treatment.
It's not right.
It's not.
So this program is about making sure those people aren't forgotten, that they have someone in their corner fighting for their rights and making sure they get what they deserve.
100%. And that, to me, that's what really sets Catalonia's plan apart. They're not just focused on hitting targets and meeting deadlines. They're really invested in protecting their people, both now and in the future.
Yeah, I love that. It's a good reminder that progress isn't just about, like, fancy technology or ambitious goals. It's about people.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
And that actually brings us to what I find most interesting about Catalonia's approach. They're not just reacting to a problem. They're actively trying to create a healthier, safer future.
Okay, now you've got my attention. Tell me more about what makes their approach so unique, so potentially groundbreaking. Okay, so we've covered a ton of ground here, everything from like futuristic plasma torches to the very human side of this whole thing. But for you, what really stands out? What's the most innovative or, dare I say, even hopeful thing about how Catalonia is tackling this?
What gets me is how they're approaching asbestos. Not just like some building problem or even an environmental hazard, but as a full-blown public health crisis. Like, it deserves a full-on response, right? Take the asbestos census, for example. That's not just about making a list. It's about gathering the kind of data that, like, epidemiologists use, the people who track disease outbreaks and stuff.
Right, right.
They're going at this with a level of detail you don't usually see with, like, environmental
It's
stuff.
like they're building a case file, but instead of a criminal, it's for asbestos. And I guess the more data they have, the better they can target their efforts, see what's working, what's not.
Exactly. And that's so smart, because then they can adjust their strategies as they go. But data aside, what really makes me optimistic is how committed they are to this multi-pronged approach.
Yeah.
They're not just going after the existing asbestos. They're thinking about prevention, education, long-term care for people who've been exposed. It's like they're trying to break the cycle,
Yeah, totally. And that's where those EU targets come into play, right? It's bigger than just Catalonia. This is a Europe-wide push to get rid of asbestos risks.
For sure. And listen, hitting those 2032 targets, super important. But what's even bigger is the whole change in mindset, right? We're not just managing the asbestos problem anymore. We're trying to, like, wipe it off the map.
And that brings us to the big question for our listeners. Could this plan, this super ambitious, forward-thinking plan, be a model for other places dealing with the same asbestos legacy?
I think it's definitely worth looking at, for sure. The sheer amount of detail in their plan, how they're using data to make decisions, the focus on short-term and long-term solutions, all of that could be adapted and used in different places, different contexts.
It just goes to show, right? We don't have to just accept these hazardous materials as part of life. If there's enough political will, enough public awareness, and, some good old-fashioned scientific innovation, I think we can get to a future where asbestos is just like a bad memory.
Well said. Catalonia, they're on this path to a truly asbestos-free future, and Honestly, I think it gives a lot of hope. They've got a good roadmap, and other regions, they'd be smart to pay attention.
Couldn't agree more. Sometimes the biggest, scariest problems, you just got to take that first step, you know? And Catalonia, they are definitely leading the charge here.